Okay, I should be able to hear you now.
I hope so, and make the conversation a lot easier. Howdy.
That's fair. I do think hearing your opponent is probably a smoother way to have a conversation.
Yeah, for
How's your day?
sure. My day's going good. Can you hear me just fine? Discord has been shitting out me lately. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, yeah, you sound fine.
Okay, fine, good. Okay, I'm happy to hear that. All right. You said, I think you said socialism will never prevail, and also that I'm dumb on Twitter. Care to explain? Oh,
Yes, those
also
were
give
my
your pronouns
exact
and name.
words.
Give your pronouns and name to chat before they get mad at me.
Yes, yes. I also called you a socialist lib cuck at the
Mhm.
same time. Somehow you can be both of those things.
It's been known.
No, so it's fair. I am Econoboi, he, him pronouns. In terms of an introduction, if yeah, what I do after I finished graduate school, mostly economics and finance focused, did poli sci undergrad as well. Decided that had a hell of a lot of free time after finishing school, so figured I'd get into making sort of educational videos, video essays on YouTube. I also do debates and stuff. So if you've ever had any sort of questions like, what should the corporate tax be? What's the stock market? What's quantitative easing? My YouTube videos on the Econoboi channel would probably be helpful enough. And I do a lot of capitalism versus socialism videos and debates as well.
And I take it your position is that the corporate tax rate should be 100%.
Look, that's probably too extreme. I would say 90% maybe. Give 10% to the corporations, but 100% is a little extreme for my taste.
All right, I'll forgive your liberalism for now. We'll see how it pans out. Okay,
All right.
so I got in hot water, and I'm using that almost with a sort of mocking sarcasm when I say that. For saying that social democracies are still imperialist and still rely on economic inequality in order to produce their outcomes. Some people didn't like that, so I called them all libs and banned them. What do you take? Do you have anything you'd like to say before I call you a lib and ban you?
Well, what I would say is that please don't ban me because I'm one of the good ones. But what I would say in regard to Nordic countries and sort of the bastions of social democracy that are held up by social democrats is that it is true to a certain extent their economies rely on you could say unequal exchange, labor exploitation, and in the third world. But the reality is that this percentage is relatively small, and so the prospect of reforming those supply chains and those systems under a capitalist framework is actually fairly feasible in today's context.
Um, all right. There are a couple of angles we can take this from. I guess the first question that I would like answered is why would they reform that?
Well, I mean, it's similar to like why would someone buy an electric car today, right? I mean, people's priorities change over time. There's actually recently The Economist released a video. They do maybe I don't want to say weekly, maybe every other week they do videos, and this video was called like "Too Woke" or "Too Broke" or something like that, and they talked about the changing investment mindset, the idea that corporations are becoming increasingly pressured to be more socially conscious, and so there's sort of a ground up ability for that to happen and trickle into governments and corporations as well. But overall, though, I think that would be my answer that people are becoming more societally conscious as the world becomes more globalized and the information age takes on maturity, and so people are going to want to see those reforms. I mean, for instance, even in I want to say there are countries that are looking at proposal, and maybe a few countries have already banned things like slave labor from supply chains or getting like taking goods from Xinjiang region, things like that. So I think the prospect of what I'm talking about isn't totally unfeasible. At least I would say it's more feasible than a global socialist revolution.
Right. Well, I don't think a global socialist revolution is coming around the turn necessarily tomorrow. I'm only saying that as a capitalist economic system, social democracies are still going to rely fundamentally on many of the inequalities that we've propagated, to supply our business interests. So, like, with regards to Norway's imports, I just take Norway. There are like a dozen countries we could use, but Norway is the one that I've been looking at a little more than others. Um,
For sure.
right. Now, I understand they get a lot of their stuff domestically, and their economy is sourced more ethically than the United States is, for sure. But it still seems like, I mean, if you were to cut out all trade, all imports from the third world or the developing world, I mean, Norway, like any other Western country, would be in dead water. And it seems like the only way to extricate yourself from that would be to economically cripple yourself by refusing to trade at all with like a significant portion of the exports produced in the world, you know?
So the narrative from what you're saying makes, narratively it makes sense. It's logical, but the issue is that it's not really necessarily bore out in the numbers. So, for instance, there was a really good, and it's quite an extreme paper in terms of the hypothetical that they uh, sort of, take on in the paper. A couple economists, one from MIT, one from Berkeley. What they tried to answer was, take the U.S. as an example. What if the US just stopped trading? Just every single good and service that people might want, they would have to get it domestically or they couldn't have it. What effect would this have if the US basically embargoed the rest of the world in terms of importing goods? And that's including the global north countries, global south countries, rich and poor countries, mineral wealth, mineral rich, service rich countries. Well, what they found was that between 2 and 8% of GDP would be lost if the US totally and completely shut down its borders. Now, if you consider that the whole entire world, about, I did a video on this,
2
about
and 8%
5%.
of the American GDP.
Yes, just America as an example. But to speak a little bit more broadly, uh, about 5% rounding up of the economy in the world, of the global north, I should say, not the world, is based on imports from the global south, about 5%. And so,
How
even
do
in
you
the
calculate that?
extreme, well, because we have trade data, right? There's data on how much imports are from what countries and where they're going to, and obviously we have a classification for global south and north, and so you can calculate it with fair ease. Obviously, your currencies and stuff, but it's all out there.
But
Now,
Are we
really
are we
quick, what I was gonna
evaluating
say.
its worth by its cost though? Because like the argument that I would make then is that it's undercosted in those areas. That's the reason why we put all the trouble into engaging in neo-imperialism. You have these foreign countries where we do rely on this stuff they bring in. And also, just because it's a small portion of our GDP doesn't mean it's unimportant, you know? Maybe 2% of our GDP goes towards lumbering, but you can't cut that out. The economy would die without that. It's not like it's not like 2% off the top, right? It's 2% out from a critical industry. It's like the difference between saying that you're removing like the roof tiling from a house, or you're removing like a like like a load bearing pillar. Like how much of a percentage of our GDP goes into like rare earth mineral stuff like lithium, right? But if we didn't have any of that, even if it counted for just 1/10 of 1% of our total GDP, we would be fucked, right? So it clearly relies on more than
um,
just that.
not not necessarily. So we to a certain extent we would be fucked if we didn't have lithium. That's true, but most every good has some sort of applicable substitute. So you're talking about like lithium batteries for whatever use you might have. Obviously, you can use nickel, you can use cobalt, things like that.
Not for
Now
modern
that's just a
batteries. You need lithium, right? That's the modern battery
well.
we use.
No, that's true, and I don't want to get bogged down in an incredibly specific example, but it's just a matter of like what they took into account for their analysis is the substitutability of trade. So the idea would be that, and this is why they give a range, so 2 to 8%. Now, if goods are incredibly substitutable, right? If basically if the U.S. produced the goods that we get abroad, but domestically, given the amounts that we have domestically, how substitutable are these? If they're incredibly substitutable, gains from trade are actually very low. If they're not very substitutable, gains from trade are very, very high. Because if we can just substitute things out, well, we don't need to trade. If we absolutely cannot substitute things out, we absolutely need to trade. Now, the point that I was going to make is that it is true that arguably it's a naive and sort of shallow analysis to just look at trade accounting to answer this question: how reliant is the global north on the global south? But I think that you can also look at the actual specific question. You can look at unequal exchange, right? Which is how much lower are, sort of the importers, basically. You could say the importers, but how much lower are the people in global South nations being paid relative to their production, relative to the production of workers in the global North? The difference is unequal exchange. And even that specific number, obviously, it's even less because it's specific. It's only 3 or 4% of GDP. That's in the video when you start arguing with your chat about people citing the 3%. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about actually the specific amount that is transferred in wealth in terms of they have this much productivity, but they're paid less for it, for some structure, some other reason or another. It's only about 3 or 4% of GDP, which the last thing I'd say,
3 to 4,
sure, go on.
3 to 4% of our GDP is accounted for by the relative gains that we achieve by relying on the lower pay that we can get in those developing countries.
That's exactly right.
Isn't that like 1 trillion USD though? I mean, you say like 3% of our GDP, like it's a tiny hit that we could weather,
Yeah.
but you're basically describing like the hit that we took from COVID. That on its own, just
Yeah.
that, like the wage differential, would be enough to single-handedly like bring about a recession, if not like worse, you know?
No, you're absolutely right. That was the second thing I was going to say when you jumped in, which was that it's absolutely the case. If you look at global North GDP over time, what you'll find is that we lost about anywhere from 3 to 4% of GDP as a result of the COVID downturn, a little under 3% of GDP as a result of the previous recession, 2008, 2009. So the idea of overnight getting rid of literally all unequal exchange is uh, it would cause a recession, but the idea that you espouse and that a lot of socialists espouse, which is that it is unsustainably the case that nations in the global north could never reform out of this. It's just not true. Even if they did it tomorrow, flick your hands and all unequal exchange is gone and there's worker parity across the world, you'd get a bad recession, but we'd make it out of it. We've had worse recessions before, but also that's not what anyone's advocating for. The reality is what most people would advocate for is change over time, over 10, 20, 30-year period, similar to any sort of reformist. And that would, of course, depress any sort of, you know, absolutely destructive effects of getting rid of unequal exchange.
The the issue that I have with this is twofold. First of all, I don't think it's theoretically impossible to do without it. I just don't think capitalist countries will do it. Capitalist countries have a long-standing history of engaging in some pretty nefarious behavior if it maintains the interests of their business consult. I mean, it seems like if I were to defer to history, like we're talking about countries that the CIA has literally overturned democratically elected leaders. I mean, we've invaded countries in large part because it, benefits our business interests, because it makes us wealthy, because it transfers wealth from their country to ours. We'll install leaders who are okay with the economic changes we enforce on their nation. The World Bank and the IMF serve as the neocolonial arms of regime change, where we say they can get the money they need to build up a country, but only if they neoliberalize in ways that make them good targets for us. So it's not about like, is it impossible to do this? It's about whether or not it's gonna happen with the incentives that we have right now.
Mhm.
Um, but I also want to add to that as well. I'm not
Sure.
convinced by this whole like which percentage of the GDP accounting narrative thing, right? So most of the GDP here in America doesn't come from manufacturing or imports. It comes from the service economy. That's like 2/3 of our economy right there. So you say that like if we cut out all goods from China, which is about $500 billion a year, if we didn't import anything from them, and that's just China, that it would only account for like 3% of our GDP. Okay, but those are goods we're bringing in. Maybe it accounts for 3% of our total GDP, but how much of it does it account for the GDP related to the actual consumption and use of physical things that we bring in from the rest of the world? If 2/3 of our GDP is trapped in the service industry, which is dependent upon the stuff that we import from other countries, that change is magnified significantly. It's like saying, it's like saying that if you stop eating like citrus foods, it only decreases the total like vitamins in your body by like 0.5%. but you need those to not get scurvy. It doesn't take it all off across the board. It takes it off in vital ways that have a disproportionate effect on the economic outcome.
Sure. So, I guess to respond sort of point by point. So, um, obviously, I think if you claim to be speaking more hyperbolically previously, I do accept the olive branch of that. It's not theoretically impossible. What I would say is that in terms of capitalist countries won't do it. They won't reform. I would say that it's not. This is not necessarily, and I know it's a shocking thing for a lot of people, is that this is also not necessarily bore out in the numbers. Obviously, people might reference, the fact that social spending as a percentage of GDP across the Western and sort of global North world has only increased, and it's only increased relatively precipitously over time. The economies of the world are spending more and more on welfare and on things that would increase equality, decrease inequality. And obviously, if we're talking about Nordic countries, that's times 100, basically. In regard to sort of the historical analysis of the CIA and the IMF. I, I I disagree in part with the CIA has sort of led particularly to the stifling of good socialist government across the world. I would take a more national security view. I mean, for instance, if the U.S. was so incredibly diametrically opposed to communism that they kill every communist movement around, why did we give military and aid in general to the Yugoslavian government under Tito in 1951? Well, it's
Because
because it was a
he
national security interest.
well,
I mean,
right, because he was able to push a wedge against the USSR by doing so. But I'm not.
absolutely.
There's no national security interest. What you're talking about right now, our national security interest is our business interests. Those are one and the same. Economically being starved out is functionally the same as losing political power. We've enforced regime change in tons of countries across the world, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia to Latin America to Central
Yeah.
America. Like, these weren't done because these guys are like gonna bomb our country or whatever. We did it because we wanted leaders in there that were willing to trade with us instead of with the USSR. We're clearly willing to kill to make sure that our businessmen can get the contracts they need.
No, and I would never take the view that this has never happened, right? I in fact totally agree with the idea that business interests, sort of economic interests more broadly, is of a national security importance, to some extent or another, right? My only point was that the focus is more a national security interest and not some sort of fervent hatred for communism abroad. For
I never
instance,
said it
again,
was
if
about fervent
you know
hatred for communism. I just think it's about securing business interests.
Well, national security interest. I get what you're saying. We might be speaking past each other. I was also going to reference the socialist Rajavan government as well as a government that the U.S. gets
Yeah, I don't think
helps out a
I
decent
don't think they
amount.
have an
But
ideological opposition to like the building of socialism. I think they have an ideological opposition to things that don't make their companies money. Usually the two overlap, but if they don't, then
well, I think yes and no. Obviously, I'm not a historian, so I'm not able to provide an incredibly in-depth analysis. But again, I do think over time it's proven that generally countries have become more amicable to redistribution and social spending. And I do think, especially in a present day context, I don't know if there's a lot of justification for like the CIA is and the IMF and the World Bank are still currently serving as quote neo-colonial arms of regime change. But the
well,
second point you brought
don't
up,
they?
sure, go on. No, I don't think so. I mean, like when you to be fair, maybe there is a modern day example of the CIA like getting like totally getting rid of socialist governments today. I'm not sure, but the point is that a lot of those instances again are more focused on national security, not necessarily like there's no reason that a socialist country uh, doesn't sort of participate in the markets. I mean, even the Soviet Union did that as well. It's just a matter of national security interests.
Well,
But
but
the
what
IMF and the World Bank are,
well,
I
there
mean,
are
they're
literally
banks.
examples
So
of the CIA getting involved because socialist governments were nationalizing industries, which meant that there were they could no longer like make money off it. I
yeah, I'm
mean,
talking about like that. No, I agree. There's examples of that. People talk to people speak about like the Iran government in the 1950s that got overthrown, sort of allegedly or supposedly. I'll give it to you about the nationalizing of the oil industry.
It's
I get all
not
that, right?
allegedly. It's
I'm not.
happened a lot. I mean, like the regime
No, no, I
change in
know.
Iran. No, no.
I'm
I'm
not.
just saying it's not about like ideological opposition to communism. It's just like this definitely has happened a lot. And the
No,
IMF
no,
and the
I
World
and
Banks,
I
these
sure.
aren't like lefty criticisms. This has happened. Like the criticism section for the IMF is pretty specific in detailing that like many countries and organizations think that they're essentially like loan sharks and strongmen whose job it is to incentivize the economic developments that pull money away from welfare programs and away from nationalization and towards like pro-Western business interest stuff, you know? Um,
Well, it depends, right? So again, I'm not going to disagree with some of that historical analysis that yes, the CIA and the U.S. government, so more broadly, or the global North even more broadly, have engaged in nefarious practices that have stifled ostensibly communist countries. Obviously, you can argue about Vietnam and Soviet whether they're communist or not. Whatever. I mean, you get what I'm saying. When it comes to the IMF and the World Bank. There's both liberal and socialist and right wing, frankly, criticisms of those institutions. What they are fundamentally are banks. They're banks charged with getting interest back on the loans that they give. You only need a loan from the IMF or the World Bank. The World Bank less so because they do more development aid, but you only need a loan from the IMF if your country is in relatively dire financial straits. And so the idea of the IMF instituting conditional financing so that they can get their money back on their loans um, again, I don't think it's necessarily a communism or capitalism thing. Capitalist countries have been strapped with IMF debt that they've been unsustainably able to repay. So
yeah,
I think
but
that
they
the
part of
IMF's
the
and well, I was going to
preconditions
say that
for
the last sentence was that
sorry.
the IMF and the World Bank's modus operandi is more sort of ideologically neutral
No,
than
again,
anything.
I'm not saying they're going after socialists. I'm just saying that they're doing whatever they can to make sure that these countries are amicable to Western business interests. They'll do that to capitalist countries too if they need to. They would do it to us if they needed to. But there's a
Well,
precondition for
when you
their
say
loans.
amicable to Western business interests, what do you mean by that?
You
Because
know
when I think of like
about the
getting
policies
someone
they
to repay a loan, I mean,
prescribe, right?
you know,
Well, they
well,
offer financial assistance on the
yeah.
condition that you liberalize your economy, which means that you open it up to the kinds of systems that allows the West to take advantage of them.
You'd have to give some specifics. In my experience researching the IMF, not the World Bank again, because they do more development aid, and I don't know if anybody's really against development aid, but the IMF specifically, a lot of the aid that they extend to nations is more based on, hey, I'm in almost every country in the world is a member of the IMF. Hey, I'm X nation. I am financially in an incredible dire spot, and the IMF might come in, lend them a bunch of money to refinance their debt and again, because they're a bank, they want to get their money back. And so part of that might be getting rid of like wasteful bureaucratic spending
Yeah.
or, balancing the fiscal state, none of which are necessarily good things in, when you're dealing with a recession. But again, if you're taking a loan from the IMF, I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
you
So
need to pay it back. It
from
creates moral hazard if you don't.
I'm not talking about paying back the loan. I'm talking about the conditions. This is in the section conditionality of loans. IMF conditionality is a set of policies or conditions the IMF requires in exchange for financial resources. The IMF does require collateral from countries for loans, but also requires the government seek assistance to correct its macroeconomic imbalances in the form of policy reform. If the conditions are not met, the funds are withheld. The concept of conditionality was introduced in a 1952 executive board decision, coincidentally right after the Cold War began, and later incorporated into the Articles of Agreement. Stuff like cutting expenditures and raising revenues, also known as austerity, focusing economic output on direct export and resource extraction. That's interesting. See, the way most wealthy countries today are wealthy is that they focused on more advanced education and technological development. But they're encouraging these countries to focus on raw resource extraction, which makes them very easy targets for Western industries and markets to buy up the stuff that they sell for cheap. The devaluation of currencies, trade liberalization, increasing stability of investment, balancing budgets, removing price controls and state subsidies, privatization or divestiture of all or part of state owned industries, enhancing the rights of foreign investors, improving governance and fighting corruption. Now, some of these are good, like balancing budgets. I mean, fine, but this is very clearly about making these countries like useful to the West with regards to trade relations.
Right. And I think the issue with reading that off is that it presumes that those are actual requirements in every instance of lending. It just depends on the country, right? So, for instance, if you're like Chile, for instance, and Chile, this is not the case currently, but say that you're Chile, right? And you're in dire financial straits. Obviously, the IMF is going to recommend that you expand your production of copper because that's a natural resource that you have. And of course, it would make sense if you need money to pay off debt that you would expand your capacity to mine copper,
Do you
right?
think it's like a
Obviously, they
coincidence that all of these things are beneficial to like the West when it comes to trading with them? Like, what
well,
about the
no,
four tigers of of Asia, you know, like Singapore and stuff? A lot of those countries became very wealthy, not by focusing on mining a bunch of oil and selling it off to the West, but actually by engaging in a fuck ton of nationalist, like local, like pricing control and a lot of, fuck, what is it called? When you're, when you like prioritize local industry? Um,
like protectionism.
yeah,
Yeah.
protectionism. Yeah. These countries that actually managed to claw their way out of poverty engaged in protectionism, built up their own industries, and rejoined the world economies when they had something unique to offer. We know that strategy works, but the IMF is advocating for the opposite: liberalization, deinvestiture, denationalization, focus on just mining more gold, more lithium, more oil. That might be good for stabilizing the budget immediately, but this is so very clearly like just a way of making these countries profitable for Western business investment. Why else would making
Yeah.
enhancing the rights of foreign investors be one of the things they focus on?
Well, because one of the ways that you can build wealth in your country is to encourage foreign investment, right? So, for instance, if we look at the example of Botswana, which a lot of people sort of hold up as an example of African development, it's one of the most developed countries in Africa. What the leaders of Botswana did after the current party in power actually first took power, which I think was in like the 1950s or something like that. Um, what they did was engage in a lot of foreign investment and public private partnerships to develop their natural resources and retain a large part of that wealth. And as a response to that private investment and good governance and sort of anti corruption policies of the early governments, Botswana is the most, arguably, the most developed country in Africa. I mean, you mentioned the four Asian tigers. A significant part of all of those countries' economies is looking outward trade. Now, if you want to have an argument about the domestic sort of production capacity and protectionism, if you're more in favor of protectionism or something like that, that's not an unreasonable argument to be had. It's not like totally unreasonable. It's just that when the IMF recommends policy changes, they're not recommending it with the idea of we want to prop up the global neo-colonial business interest. It's we're a bank lending money, and these are the conditions by which your country, at least historically is the case, are able to build wealth depending on the country, and will be able thusly to pay back your debt and finance yourself more sustainably.
This is, but no, I'm sorry. This is either dishonest or delusional. The IMF and the World Bank are clearly economically partisan organizations. They have been widely criticized for not actually engaging in the kind of policy prescriptions that make countries better. In fact, the universality of their conditions is one of the things they often get criticized for. They don't take into consideration what's good for that country. Instead, they just apply a blanket set of pro Western business interests. I'm not opposed to trade. But Botswana is an interesting case for you to cite because their economy is all diamonds. What do you think is going to happen when the world demand for diamonds falls off? That country is going to burn. Botswana's entire economy is dependent on making sure that global diamond trade and demand is high. The United States is not. South Korea is not. Countries with strong, robust economies don't rely on the export of a single rare material. We saw this happen in Venezuela. Whenever you focus your economy on the export of a single commodity, if prices crash, that's it. All your people starve. Botswana hasn't built itself a strong economy. It's just riding a bubble for as long as it has diamonds, and diamonds sell well. But that's not the same thing. Like 10 years from now, you realize Botswana might end up being the next Venezuela, right? Like the next thing people look at and go, oh, well, they should have diversified.
Well, no, not necessarily. So the answer is theoretically yes. I'm certainly not being dishonest when talking to you, and I'm not defending the IMF necessarily. I think I have my own criticisms for the IMF as well. In the video that I made about the IMF, one of the final points that I made was that indeed you can hate the IMF and not like what they do. It's just that you should do it for the right reasons, right? Conditional financing is bad, not because it stifles socialist government abroad. But because when socialist governments get in financial trouble and they go into a recession, they don't necessarily need to cut spending further. Everyone agrees that austerity is bad, but IMF is not concerned with, well, if I can finish, the IMF isn't necessarily concerned with sustain. How do I put it? Getting these countries out of recession. They're concerned with countries being able to sustainably finance themselves and getting their money back on their loans. They're a bank.
They care about they care about making these countries ripe for liberal investment. That's why all of their conditions are amicable to that. Otherwise, they would not focus on some of the stuff that they focus on here. I mean, it's so clearly like we get long-term adjustment policies usually includes. We talked about privatization and divestiture, and making things easier for foreign governments, reducing government expenditure and government employment. In what world is reducing government expenditure on developing infrastructure not damaging to these countries? Every successful country in the world today spends a lot of government money on building out infrastructure, on securing basic provisions for existence, but they encourage you not do that because they don't care if these people have an educated population. They care if they have a population that's well fed enough to work in the oil rigs or the diamond mines that they can then sell off to Western businesses. Botswana is wealthy because De Beers and those other diamond companies in the West buy up the products that they sell. This is a favorable enterprise to us and an unfavorable one to them because we're denying them the ability to develop a truly autonomous economic situation. Like we're just relying on raw resource extraction.
Yeah, I don't think so. The goal of most any economy, especially smaller nations that might not have as much sort of diversified resource wealth, isn't necessarily to be autonomous, right? Because again, you said you're in favor of trade. Of course, you'd understand that trade requires specialization to a certain extent, and with specialization and sort of engaging in international trade, you can build wealth that way. That's what Botswana has done. For instance, when you could look at Norway as another example where they've really leaned in to their oil wealth, right? Now, what they've done is taken a lot of that wealth and put it in a social wealth fund, diversify that wealth fund, and then put that money right back into the economy in the form of
this is not
many different
comparable.
investments.
If diamond prices go down, Botswana crashes. If oil prices go down, which they have, Norway has a diversified economy that can survive because Norway is in the imperial core where we apply economic policies that make sure we survive, that prioritize our growth and our development, whereas Botswana is in the imperial periphery, which exists only insofar as it is useful to our businesses, and we couldn't give a damn about them otherwise. This is exactly the same thing that China's doing, but they're better at it. The Belt and Road Initiative at least involves a degree of infrastructural investment. That means these countries aren't going to crash the next time oil or diamond or lithium prices fluctuate based on the next recession. We have to be like, this is an incredibly inequitable exchange. Earlier in this convo, you talked about how the US could like shrug off no longer trading with China, which I disagree with, but at least we do have a diversified economy.
Well,
they don't
didn't say
have
that to be fair.
Okay, but they don't have that luxury. These other countries, now South Korea does, Singapore does. They could do that because they have diversified economies, but Botswana could not. They rely on us completely and totally, which means that we can do anything we want to them because they have no recourse.
Again, well, to be fair, again, I don't think Botswana is absolutely singularly a diamond economy. Of course, they're diversified to a certain
extent.
It's
62% of their exports is diamonds, and the majority of their GDP comes from the wealth they gain from exports. A lot of other stuff that they sell, like up to 80% in total alongside the diamonds, is stuff like nickel. It's other earth minerals and metals they mine up.
Yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't take the position that diamonds are not a significant part of the Botswanan economy. It's only the idea that the argument that you're making is more or less, how do I put it? Like, essentially, the argument that you seem to be making is that Botswana's economy is bad, and though they have built a lot of wealth from their diamond mines, it is not necessarily the most sustainable because at some point maybe diamonds become worthless and all of a sudden a third of their economy just gets wiped off the map because they've not diversified. Now, to a certain extent, that's true, but that's why I bring up the idea of like Norway, where they have taken advantage of their resource wealth, very much so, and they've diversified it, arguably in a more responsible way than what Botswana has done, right? Now, we can make sort of these arguments about, Botswana's economy is not as diversified, Norway's economy, maybe the social wealth fund's good or bad, whatever. The whole point that I'm trying to get at is that the IMF, flaws and all, good or bad, whatever, is not necessarily an institution that's based sort of singularly on uh, stifling good socialist governments abroad. I mean, for instance,
you keep
Ecuador took
saying
it.
that.
Well, what I was going to say, hold on. For instance, what I was going to say was that Ecuador recently took a financing agreement with the IMF, and it's not like Ecuador had to get rid of their national oil company, right? So it's a lot of examples and nuance in all of this
I'm not
analysis
saying
that I
that
think
they
we miss.
always do all of their preconditions, but they're always trying to make these countries more amicable to Western business investment. And I have never said it's about taking down socialist countries. I'm only saying that they're trying to make these countries easier to invest in. They'll do that to feudal
Well,
countries if they need to. It's
you,
not.
you, you did say that the IMF was an arm of neo-colonial regime change, which
Yes,
I,
that
I
is
think.
objectively the case. But they'll do that to
Okay,
anyone
well,
who's not favorable to
sure.
Western business interests. No, this is what, like, how can I trust your opinion on whether or not Norway or other social democracies engage in neocolonialism when you're not willing to admit that the IMF and the World Bank do exactly that? Like, it'd be like me trying to
No,
talk to
I've
somebody
already
about like sexual
sure.
assault, and then they're like, dude, it's not like rapey if, like, she's drunk. Like your way of
Okay, well,
perceiving, no, your way of perceiving like the fault that I'm trying to look at here is totally different from mine. Like, I think, like, we have very different preconceptions when it comes to stuff like this, right?
well, sure, but it's important to recognize those preconceptions, and I'm recognizing without a doubt that the IMF is not perfect. There's a lot of criticisms for the IMF to be had. Arguably, it shouldn't exist as an institution, and that they've done arguably more bad than good, some good, maybe not more than bad. So I'm making all those concessions in my analysis. I'm really what I'm arguing against is the idea that the IMF is focused on regime change, incredible neocolonialism, when really the way that I view it is the IMF is a bank, similar to how, like you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative for China. Something that they're concerned with, of course, is their lending arrangements that include being paid back. This is why they get in all that trouble with. You hear about the Sri Lankan case with the Chinese lending because Sri Lanka wasn't able to pay back Chinese loans, and that's why China gets a lot of the same criticism the IMF does because right now, China is trying to get money from Sri Lanka, even though it's a heavily indebted nation. I mean, that's the main point. It's a good faith
Yeah, I
argument.
got.
I'm not trying to be dishonest.
No, I know. It's just, can I read this blurb from the Wikipedia? From the 1950s
Sure.
outward, the United States doled out loans to third world nations, now referred to as least developed countries. The U.S. encouraged neoclassical and free market economics in LDCs for two reasons. One, countering the spread of socialist ideology during the Cold War, and two, as a means of accumulating wealth by means of foreign direct investment as well as interest on the loans. The immediate and stated and clear goals from the beginning of this organization with regards to the structural adjustment policies we've talked about were explicitly about maintaining ideological hegemony and by accumulating wealth. Nothing here, their stated goals were not helping the third world. When the fuck have we ever cared about helping the third world? When has the West ever given a single shit about the development of those countries? We spit on them. We only
Well,
care about their development
no. I mean,
insofar as it's beneficial to our economy. In particular, Western companies sought to gain access to raw commodities, especially
by
minerals
the
and
way,
agricultural
quickly,
products.
where are you reading from?
Wikipedia, history, wiki structural adjustment, hashtag criticisms. This is under the IMF article.
Okay, gotcha. Go on.
Yeah. In particular, Western companies sought to gain access to raw commodities, especially minerals and agricultural products, often in exchange for capital or large-scale infrastructural projects. After the run on the dollar of the 1980s, the United States adjusted its monetary policy and instituted other measures so it could begin competing aggressively for capital on a global scale. This was successful, as it can be seen from the current account of the country's balance of payments. Enormous capital flows to the United States had the corollary of dramatically depleting the availability of capital to poor and middling countries. Giovanni Arrighi has observed this scarcity of capital, which was heralded by the Mexican default of 1982. Quote, created a propitious environment for the counter-revolution of developmental thought and practice that the neoliberal Washington Consensus began advocating at about the same time. Taking advantage of the financial straits of many low and middle income countries, the agencies of the consensus foisted them measures of structural adjustment that did nothing to improve their position in the global hierarchy of wealth, but greatly facilitated the redirection of capital flows towards sustaining the revival of US wealth and power. So, like, I don't think I'm giving like a crazy lefty take here or anything. Like, this is this is what the org does. We don't care about the developing world. We care about them only insofar as we invest in them.
Right. Well, sure. I guess again, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree to a certain extent. I don't think that there have certainly been a lot of development programs that the U.S. and the global North broadly have contributed to in terms of trying to build out, either the resource wealth or just the institutions of other nations.
Why would we help
You
them
can
for their
call it
sake?
well. I
Like, why
mean,
do we
what do
care?
you mean? Well, it's sort of like saying why do we have welfare programs, right? I mean, to a certain extent,
To
we do
keep
want to provide aid.
to
Sure, go
keep
on.
our population from revolting. Why would we help them? We even did the Marshall Plan just to keep communist ideology from spreading in Europe. Like, everything we do has a price
Well,
tag attached to it. Why would we do something for other countries just like to help them out?
I mean, again, you can ultimately reduce every single thing down to like sort of an amoral type, egoist sort of. Oh, we always do everything ultimately to help ourselves. I mean, maybe that's right. I'm not really sure, but the point is that that's true for every other country too. I mean, when you talk about China, the reason they engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative in the first place was because they wanted to develop export markets for themselves so that they can diversify away from the global North
Yes.
broadly because they don't. Right, because
Yeah,
they
they're
don't
doing
want
the
to be
same
reliant.
thing. And they're also a capitalist country that invests in the third world so they could steal money from them. Yeah.
Well, right, but I guess it gets confusing when you said that China just does it better than us. Like, I guess,
Oh, sorry, they're
well,
more
I don't.
effective than us because they aren't limited by the democratic process. They're much more aggressive in their investment, whereas any investment the US did, it has to be done through subsidiaries like the IMF or World Bank because US citizens would never consent to having money spent on investments in developing countries because we hate them. If
Well,
Americans were
the
smart
yeah,
and
sure.
self-interested, we would be okay with a few percentage points of our GDP more going to developing nations because we could invest in them and fuck their economies to our benefit. But Americans are so stupid and so despicably hateful towards the rest of the world that they can't even understand the basic principles of neocolonialism. We would rather have our money spent on the military than towards the actual mechanisms that actually lead to the control of the world. China is not a democracy, so their leaders are free to use their money to invest in other countries and exploit them in the ways that we can only do through the IMF and World Bank.
Well, sure. I think, well, again, to be fair, I think one of the things that actually I think happened under the Trump administration was a international infrastructure development bank, which was U.S. controlled, not just the IMF and the World Bank. Obviously, you could have the same criticisms for those institutions. I think overall, we again, we're going to have to agree to disagree on the IMF necessarily. I think my final point on the IMF would just be that. I view the IMF more as a bank rather than a force of regime change. I think that a lot of the negatives of the IMF are better explained by that mindset than your mindset. And I think the criticism is more palpable with my mindset than yours. Um, but would you mind if I move on? That was actually your first point. There's a
Yeah,
second
we
point you
got
made that
kind
I.
of on a tangent there. Yeah, yeah, we can move
You're
on
good.
because I don't have too much time. We got kind of we'll be more productive in the next one. Yeah, hit me up.
Sure, no worries, sure worries. So you said your second point was you're not convinced by GDP accounting in general, and it seemed that you gave the example of oh, if you stop taking vitamin A, that's only like 5% of your vitamin intake, but you really need vitamin A in your body, right? Or you'll die without it, or something bad will happen. Not a doctor. And you use that as an example of like, well, how much of our GDP is based on rare earth elements, and if we stopped getting those or lithium, the economy would be structurally, very, very unsound because we need those. So, and you also mentioned that the U.S. economy is mostly services, and services require physical goods, which are very necessary. So, some things to say on these points, and I think the point I'm going to make is applicable to all your points. Um, it is true, obviously, that you need sort of these primary inputs for a lot of the production of the economy. You need iron for steel, you need steel for building, and you need buildings to house all those white collar workers or whatever for the services they provide. That's all true, but I think that number one, assuming again that what I'm advocating for, or what the sort of world I see, is a more sort of autarky style world where people are more closed off. Really, what I'm advocating for is the opposite, to become even more open and globalized. And what I would say is that unequal exchange, which is just the idea that workers in the global south would be raised to a living standard, at least equitable to their productive capacity, wouldn't necessarily shut off trade. It wouldn't mean that we wouldn't have access to those resources.
Why would
But
we
what
do
I would
that though?
say, so, so I think the first point that I made was, it was literally the first point I made in this debate, was the idea that investors across time have become a lot more sort of uh, socially conscious. It's called ESG investing. I'm sure you're aware, environmental, social, and government style investing. And just the idea would be that across time, it seems that shareholders and investors are becoming more and more socially conscious, and more aware of the impacts that they have that trickle out outside the realm of just their corporate doors and their profit margins.
How are
And
they changing?
uh, well, so for instance, the phenomenon of ESG investing has become a big thing. For instance, Chase just released a guideline for their portfolio of lending, which showed that they actually have actual renewable energy mandates in their portfolio that, well, not renewable, but like carbon sequestration, or carbon reduction mandates in their portfolio. Which is to say that Chase said, if you don't reduce your carbon footprint by this amount in a weighted average sense of who we lend to, we will not lend to you anymore. You'll have a great restriction in how much we lend to you. That's Chase Bank,
Is it a
right?
meaningful
Um,
restriction?
I want to say, so they delineate their emissions into, quote, scope 1, 2, and 3. Um, I I couldn't. I think scope 3 is like methane. Scope 1 is like carbon. I don't know what scope 2 is. And the cuts are essentially, the goal would be net zero 2050, which is kind of what the what the climate industry has, with, not climate industry, it sounds conspiratorial, but that's essentially what scientists have said is sort of the deadline to become net zero. And so you see a lot of banks and a lot of corporations taking on net zero pledges, even though it's probably more profitable not to do it.
Well,
And so,
I've been seeing
yeah, sure.
companies take net zero pledges for a long time now, and I've been seeing very few net zero companies. It seems to me like this is just another way for companies and investors to, you know, spritz up, to sort of hand wave, what would you call, whitewash the harm they do, you know? Like when GM had that green logo. I mean, I want to know, like, is this pledge even legally binding, or is this just some big virtue signal they're trying to throw out there to lessen the extent of Washington
Sure.
regulations on climate change? Because they were hoping to convince Washington and voters that conscientious companies are doing enough. I mean, because like that's historically that's always how it's been, right? Every time companies actually have to take a profit hit in order to make the world a better place, they have to be regulated into doing it. They never voluntarily do it. They lie about voluntarily doing it, or they'll try to trick the public. Clean coal, you remember that? I mean, Christ, we've seen this for decades. It's good marketing, but it doesn't change anything. I would need to see real actionable change being done here. How long of a deadline do we have? Like, how long before I see Chase actually stop loaning out to a company because they're not meeting those goals? I bet you I never will.
Sure. So I've got the pledge right here. In terms of the oil and gas, they'd have to reduce emissions by 35% by 2030, for instance. So I think it's a fairly sizable reduction in carbon
If
emissions,
it
at least in the
happens,
next 9 years.
am I supposed to
No, I
suck them
understand, but
off
you
for the
you
next 9 years because they said they do a
no, no,
cut?
no.
I've said, look, I fucked girls with
Vosh, I'm
virginity
not
pledges. All
saying.
right, I'm just saying. I don't, people are
Well, yeah,
shiftless. You know, it's
yes, we've all heard of and or seen the promise ring laid on the nightstand, metaphorically, we could say. So, what I was going to say is that, of course, it's the case that you said, are these like legally binding? Of course, Chase is doesn't. It's a corporation, obviously, so there's no like law or anything like that. It's just a commitment to say that if you don't reduce your emissions by this date, we will stop lending to you, which I think is a fairly reasonable mandate. Of course, you asked the question, or you posed maybe the thought that, well, we don't see a lot of carbon neutral companies today. Well, again, these are pledges in the future to align with what the scientific consensus is on climate change and warming. So, of
they're
course,
not
if the goal is
pledges
in
now.
2050,
There are things they could do right now to lower their emissions if they wanted to take a cut to their profits. Why is it always in the future? If they really cared, wouldn't they do it like right now rather than
well,
deferring it to some point in
companies.
the future?
again, companies are taking those pledges. I talked about the boom of
Pledges, but
ESG investing.
what about the
Well,
actual the changes
well,
though?
when I say taking those pledges, what I should have said is enacting those pledges to a certain extent. I talk about the boom of ESG investing that's coming online right now, and so companies are currently making strides right now to try and reduce their emissions and try and enact that. Which is just to say that it is an example of companies, not organically, to be fair. People want this, investors want this, to be more green, despite it potentially hitting their profit margins. And I've already, again, at the first part of this conversation, I mentioned examples of countries that have taken steps to limit their supply chain, including things like slave labor or child labor, despite the fact that it might hurt businesses. So if we're moving
That can
to a more
happen,
sort
yeah.
of
Did,
yeah, if we're moving to a more sort of practical argument, I think that practically it would be possible, and it's been seen, and it's currently being
but
seen right
what
now.
can you name like a major company that's taken a hit, that whose shareholders have taken a hit because with no regulation pressuring them to, they've cut back on their carbon emissions?
So you're asking, if I understand the question, you are asking, name a company that is currently net zero or has significantly reduced their sort of
No,
contribution to human
yeah,
suffering.
I mean, yeah, like they have really like cut back on this, or like any other big socially conscientious thing that led to like a significant hit to their worth as a company, you know? Because if they're doing it only
Um,
in ways that don't hurt the net worth of their company, I don't care about that. If their investors can look at the numbers and find out that it's not a hurt to them to make these changes, that's great and all, but that doesn't solve the problem because it will be a hurt to these companies to stop relying on unequal exploitation of the developing world, guaranteed. So I need to see they're willing to take that hit, you know?
sure, sure. So it's it's a question that I'm not sure is possible to ask or to answer. So, and the reason I would say that is because obviously, if investors want them to do these things and they do these things, well, there's no necessary reason why stock values would take a big hit because that's what shareholders are asking for. They're going to keep their stock right now.
Their profit
So
would be lower because they
well,
would,
sure, but I'm saying
yeah.
that if nobody sells their stock, even if profits go lower, you don't end up with lower stock value because obviously stock value is just based on supply and demand of stock. So it's unfortunately it's a question that it's difficult to engage in. But I would love it. I think a question that I would pose is, what is generally your point, right? What is your point regarding getting rid of unequal exchange? Would the idea just be that companies won't allow it and they'll lobby governments to prevent it from happening, or what does that
Yeah.
broader point look like?
Yeah, that's been happening for decades. Why would they ever want why would investors in the West ever want changes to happen that would make them less money? I've my entire life, and for the life of my father and his father before him, and going back a while, all they've ever done is do things that make them money. That's all they can do. There aren't really historical examples of people going against this trend. Sometimes the people in a country, in a democracy, fight and they fight and they fight, and they get regulations put through, you know. But every time the industries fight against it, when there were no regulations on like diesel or gasoline that choked the air of New York City back in 1927, it was not the goodwill of companies that led them to regulate like the manufacturing of gas. People protested and Washington forced those regulations. When it came to cigarettes and the carcinogens within them, they lied for decades about it. When climate change was known back in the 1960s, the oil and gas companies lied about it for decades despite having unfalsifiable evidence that it was the case. Your idea is that we can somehow overwrite this near ubiquitous trend of economic interests playing out with no concern to externalities, which is in this case the third world, you know,
Sure.
without like hurting its bottom line. But that just never happens. They always, always, always promote their interests above everyone else's.
Well, sure. So I may have misunderstood the initial question. So when you asked why would they sort of get rid of unequal exchange, I thought you were talking about more on the company side. Now, obviously, the government regulation plays a big role in pushing sustainability and things like that. I think you've got a bit of a contradictory narrative where sort of on one hand you've got companies that are lobbying government, preventing all this good action from happening, but then well, we do see a lot of environmental regulations, and we do see a lot of sort of sustainability pushes and
What
investment
environmental
in
regulations?
Well, I mean, the entirety of the EPA and everything that they do. I mean, take the Clean Air Act that reduced emissions or sort of air pollutants significantly in the United States, right? I mean, you might argue that like the coal lobby or someone, whoever, lobbied against that or something, but it ended up getting
Every
passed.
time,
I think it
yeah.
was the Carter administration.
Right, yeah, and
Well,
a lot of them got
sure,
undone or
yeah.
weakened by future presidents. That's the thing, right?
Well,
Well, companies
sure.
can pollute the ground, the water, and the air, and you can get people real outraged, and that outrage might lead to change in Washington. But how long before the people forget? You have clean air and water for long enough, and people start to forget. Public interest drops off. You know whose interest never drops off? Shareholders. Because while the public may have fought for X or Y 30 or 40 years ago, eventually they'll get old and die, and a new generation will be voting. And who's still there waiting for those people to forget? It's lobbyists. And they talk to the government and they say, hey, honest to God, I don't think people care much anymore. Reduce this regulation, packages as part of a debureaucratization program. Say that it's investing in business, say that it'll increase the GDP. And then they go ahead and do it. All these regulations got whittled down. We saw this with tax rates and we saw this with everything. There is basically no regulatory element to the United States that has not been whittled away at with time. Corporations have an interest and an incentive to be permanently politically engaged. The people only react to what they can see and feel, and they will never see or feel what's happening in the third world. We spend billions of dollars promoting a completely insular media space where we are utterly removed from the consequences of our economy to the rest of the world.
So I think it seems like your narrative would imply that environmental regulations are strongest when they were originally proposed and passed. And I don't think that anyone would say that the EPA, when originally conceived under Nixon or under the Clean Air Act when Carter passed it, is the time in which the United States had the most environmental and most robust regulations, right?
Only
Of
that it
course,
gets
these regulations,
chipped away at with
sure, go on.
time. They get chipped away at
Well,
with
but
time.
no, but well, sure, but that again, that implies that as it's chipped away, it does not become more than what it was originally was, right? And so I don't think that anyone in business or anyone in sort of common parlance would say that environmental regulations are have only ever gotten worse since
But
the EPA in the
I'm
United
not I'm
States
not saying they can
had been.
only get worse. Public interest can
You said,
fuel more climate change or regulatory laws, but eventually they do get whittled away. Like pretty much
I'm
every
sorry, yeah. So you're,
major environmental regulation that has
I,
been passed more than 10 years ago has at least seen some kind of compromise thrown its way, has it not?
I No, not really. I mean, like, I think maybe I mean, as one example, for instance, okay, something that the Trump administration actually did. It was December of 2020, like right before they left, kicking and streaming, I should say. They passed a new tax credit for carbon capture. Right now, obviously, if there's no reason for them to incentivize something like that if they're just sort of in the pocket of the oil lobby. Obviously, we're talking about the Trump administration, for God's sake. So, I think
Do
that
you did
that
you
is but
not
one example.
wait, do you
Sure, go
not
on.
think the Trump administration was in the pocket of the oil companies?
No, no, no. I'm not asking you necessarily to engage in that specific example. My point is that indeed Trump was a very much more pro-oil president than Obama or than Biden is currently. My point is just to say that the narrative, and I think what would, well, I'm not going to suggest what you say, obviously, on your platform, but I think that in general, the narrative that environmental regulations only get chipped away, and the only time that they're built up is as a result of some sort of voter outrage. It might be true in large part, but I do think that right now, again, with the boom of ESG investing, with shareholders trying to make more sort of actions in sustainability and diversity and good governance and things like that, I do think you start to see that a little bit more organically. And to bring it,
So,
last sentence that I'd say is that to bring it around to the original discussion on unequal exchange, I think that um, there is a place for government regulation, and I don't think that even if you could say that companies won't do this organically, I'm not sure, but I do think there's a place for government regulation, and I'm not sure that's bore out in a modern context that governments are unwilling to regulate that kind of thing.
okay. So a few things. First of all, I
Sure.
don't think Donald Trump passing tax credits for carbon capture really counts because if he really cared, he would punish companies who push out carbon, not reward companies who don't. All like
Well,
carbon
reward
capture,
companies who capture carbon,
all,
obviously.
yeah, all tax credits do, even if they're incentivized through carbon capture, is give more money to businesses, which is consistent with his entire policy platform. This doesn't hurt companies who continue the status quo when it comes to carbon production at all. It's just
No,
tax
it
credits.
does
It's
though.
like
It's opportunity cost, right?
it's
I mean,
not no
obviously, if you're
no no of no
capturing the
it doesn't hurt the existing companies. They're not affected. All this really is like you can get some tax credits if you capture carbon dioxide. This isn't a meaningful way of pushing people. If you need you listen, incentives are about the carrot and the stick, okay? And this is a weak carrot and a non-existent stick. I feel like you keep avoiding my general point in favor of snipping out like little exceptions. The general trend when it comes to environmental regulations is that you see a surge of their promotion, but you see them whittled away with time. Not all of them ubiquitously. I'm not saying that the maximum environmental regulation we had was right when the EPA was formed. I'm only saying that as a trend, this is something that the public is not great at monitoring perfectly because it requires a near perfect level of continuous information on subjects that require a lot of expertise. Whereas do. Corporations do have a constant and perfect understanding of the political situation with regards to environmental regulation. There are people paid seven figures to do exactly that. So not only do they have a material interest, they also have the means and the knowledge necessary to effect those changes. I need to see some evidence of American corporations, of the modern economic system, meaningfully and willingly limiting its economic output for humanitarian reasons, because I can't think of any. Governments will sometimes do stuff like this with public outrage, but there is no public outrage for what American businesses do in foreign countries. Nobody cares. Coca-Cola was funding death squads and nobody gave a shit. It was a lefty meme on Twitter for like 3 months. That's it. Americans have been taught not to care. We do not get taught about foreign countries. We do not learn about their leaders, their languages, their struggles, and we certainly do not learn where they get their money from. This is a deliberate, not on every level, not every teacher, but broadly, a deliberate product of a political and economic isolationism that allows us to enjoy quite a bit at the world's expense. It's not like we've only done this recently and that we only do it economically. We do it in a bunch of ways. We've done it historically when it comes to the plight of the Orient, the foreign world, what we did and what we took from them. It's exactly what empires did back during the old colonial days when we literally sent soldiers abroad to go steal vases and portraits. This is a continuation of a long-standing historical trend. All we've done is anonymize and abstracted it. And unfortunately, I think in a way you're being an avatar of that like colonial force because you're arguing in essence. I mean, I'm sorry, but you came here straight-facedly to argue that investors are going to be more green and more ethical in the future, so we should trust them to like make these changes and
That's not
take
at
a
all what
price
I'm
hit.
arguing,
No,
to be
you
fair.
you did. I was like, they're not going to take a
No,
price hit if it means
didn't say
humanitarian.
we should trust them though. Didn't say
Well,
we should trust them.
then what were
Just
you
try to point to a
implying?
general trend. No, so you asked you again. This might have been a misunderstanding of the question, but you asked why would they do it, and so I point to the trends in ESG investing that are organic, that companies are engaging these pledges. You
Pledges.
could
Why
say
not now? You can
no.
do it now. They could do it
God sakes,
right
Vash.
now.
No, but okay. Well, Vash, I'm not sure what you mean they could do it right now. I've already conceded that if we were to get rid of unequal exchange tomorrow, we would in fact see a recession and see that happening. My only argument is that it could be reformed over time, which you agreed with. To be fair, we're just having a more practical argument right now. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying you should trust companies just take care of it themselves. I'm not a libertarian or an ANCAP or anything like that. It's just to say that I do think there is an organic movement that can be part of the mix of that movement and also government regulations that ultimately lead to unequal exchange being eliminated to some degree, right? That you can see worker parity across the world. Now, to be fair, I'll say the exact same thing that you said about socialism is that you said you don't see a socialist revolution happening anytime soon, and I don't see what I'm describing happening necessarily anytime soon either. I just think that it's possible, and I think that we do see trends towards that direction.
I mean, if the trend is corporations taking virtue signally pledges and not actually doing anything, then I guess, yeah, they've been doing that for a while. Like that's just like a big PR move. But never in like the never in like the history of the market economy can I think of an example of a major corporation for humanitarian reasons, like limiting the stock price and the profitability of their company. I can't think of it, and I can't think of the U.S.
Well,
The
there's
United States
obviously.
ever engaging in humanitarian investment abroad or
Do you think
regulating stuff like
companies?
that for no reason.
Do you think? Do you think companies today engage in no social spending or like charity at all? I
They
mean,
charities are tax loopholes. Wealthy
char-
people. Wait, no.
come on,
Companies.
Bosh, come
Wait,
on.
wait. Do you not know how charities work in the context of a lot of these like things? The reason
So I do
charities can
understand. Yeah,
incentivize
sure, go on.
certain forms of investment. They're good for PR, and they mean that you can qualify for some other stuff. No, companies don't generally like they don't have meetings where they like go to like stockholders and go like, oh well, I know you guys all wanted your prices to be X this year, but you know if we're gonna like actually just give a bunch of money to charity. Charity is usually just another component. The tax laws for charity in the United States are sometimes very beneficial to corporations. Now, I'm not familiar with all of the specifics on that, but I do know that there have been like write-ups about it and the ways that they can use it to avoid some other potential economic problems. Like I can research it next stream, so I have a
Sure.
more particular understanding of the issue.
Yeah, no worries. I think obviously that would be very educational for the stream and everyone. But my point was to say that obviously charities do engage in a decent enough amount of sort of charity and social outreach right now. But obviously it's the case that those are deducted from their taxes, but you're not getting like the value of that tax deduction is only the tax rate times the spending. You're not getting the full amount of spending
No,
back,
there are other
and you're still
things.
spending more. No, well, hold on. To be fair, again, there are tax loopholes regarding charity, but I don't think it's the case that the overwhelming amounts or even some, even or certainly all of charity spending is just some crazy tax loophole by corporations. And the only reason I bring that up is because you brought, can you name even a single example of companies sort of spending more money than they otherwise would need to on societal benefit or at the detriment of their share price? And by
Is it
that I
to
mean
the
obviously
detriment?
cash flow return to shareholders. Well, obviously, when share price in theory and typically in practice is the idea of future expected return in the form of cash flow, and when you're decreasing that amount in the form of charitable givings, well, yes, you necessarily be decreasing the amount that your stock would be worth. Right now, that's all I'm saying. It's not a controversial claim to say that there's more than even a single example of companies engaging in charitable giving at the detriment of their free cash flow. Obviously, the money has to come from somewhere.
Everything.
And that's all I'm saying. I think that your absolutist position is necessarily it's got to be necessarily incorrect. I mean, you've got to see where I'm coming from with that, right?
Well, no. No, not even
So you
slightly.
you think no you think
if
no
if we're
company
talking about
engages
if we're
in
talking about like chump
sure.
change, like if you take a look at major mega corporations and you take a look at the amount that they donate to charity, the idea that this in any way transposes onto like them being willing to incur like massive hits to their profitability, um,
No,
for
but well, hold on.
humanitarian
Let me
reasons.
let me stop you right there because that is not my point. My point isn't that companies would be willing to engage in quote massive hits to their profitability in the name of sort of social giving or charity. My point is that they would engage in minor hits to their profitability. And when we're talking about economic wide scales, unequal exchange is just not a big part of the economy. And it is
It
not unreasonable to
absolutely
assume
is.
3% is not a
No,
big
no.
part,
Look,
right?
I've been really nice to you, but I can't let this slide. Okay, it's 3%
Yeah,
at
go
the
for it.
at the costs we pay for their goods, which are undervalued because they're being assembled by sweatshop workers instead of United States citizens. And our manufacturing and industry economy GDP percentage is around 18%. 3% out of 18% is 1 out of 6, or around 17% in total. But it's worse than that. It's not just the industry that we receive and the physical goods that we receive directly. If you talk about the undercosting, it's possible that the imports that we get could contribute to a significant portion, not only of our industrial GDP, but also to the services associated with them. All of the electronic goods and raw resources that we get from them for a dollar, like cents off the dollar, we then use
Sure.
20 times over in our country. You may get oil from another country, but it gets refined and manufactured and sold and bought and used
Sure.
and etc. Lumber,
What,
how many times does lumber get transacted once it
what,
reaches our borders?
when
This
I
is
say
not
unequal exchange,
insignificant.
when I say unequal exchange, what does that mean to you?
The fact that we rely on the comparative degree of economic underdevelopment in the developing world in order to extract favorable business and trade relations from them.
So it's a bit more specific than that. So unequal exchange, and I'll say this is just the idea that, say, if an Indian worker can produce like 1 pound of wood an hour or something, and then an American worker can produce 1 pound of wood an hour, theoretically they on an exchange rate should be paid the exact same. But Indian workers are paid less per unit of production than like American workers. As an example, obviously I don't know about the wood industry in India or anything, but that to me is what unequal exchange is. And so when you say, oh, it's only 3% because of the comparatively low living standards that we enforce, the reason I disagree with that is because unequal exchange is literally taking into account that difference in pay. That if we equalized that difference, if the standard of work and productivity was equal across countries, it is 3% of GDP. It's 3%. That's what it is. And
No,
that's a significant portion of the economy
no,
if gotten rid of in 1 year.
it's 3% if all the people assembling them were being paid American union wages. No, no, it's
No,
not.
no, no. It's three. It's no, no. Well, that's not what I said though. It's 3% if Indian workers were paid per their productivity, because Indian workers or global South workers
What is
broadly are less
per their
productive on
productivity?
average.
Wait, if you work in a
So
factory for 8 hours a day, whether you're in the United States or India, what is the paid per productivity for an Indian worker working in a factory?
right.
What
So
is
I
that
think that this
exactly?
is where, well, I'm trying to explain. So this is where I think it, I could illuminate a little bit more. So the reason that global South workers are less productive on average than like global North workers isn't necessarily because they're like dumber or anything like that, or their hands don't work right or anything. Part of it is lack of educational attainment. Sure, that contributes somewhat to productivity,
Well,
but also
it's
part of it
a it's a
is lack of
shame
access.
it's a shame that there are international
Sure.
loan sharks who discourage them from spending government money on infrastructure like investment then, huh?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, I've already disagreed with that in large part. Obviously, global South nations have quality universities to go to and everything like that. It's just a matter of
Do they?
overall wealth. What I was trying to say. Well, yes, there are quality universities in India. Vaush, come on,
Enough
don't. I
enough
mean,
for the
let's get real
population?
here.
How what's the average what's the average like educational attainment in India? Do you think it's comparable to the United States? They have like
No, no,
1.1 billion
uh,
people. I'm sure they have
well,
some
no, Vash,
universities.
that's part of my that's part of my point is that on average, Indian workers, and we're using Indian as an example, just global South more broadly, workers are less educated, so that contributes part of which to their productivity. That's less, but also part of it is access to capital. So obviously, if you have like the latest and greatest machines available, your workers are going to be per unit more productive than workers that don't have the latest and greatest capital available. So
What's the
all
number?
I'm saying is the number of what.
What is the productivity of an Indian worker?
Um, I'm explain how it's relevant. Obviously, I don't know the exact answer to that question.
Everything you're talking about right now is justifying us underpaying them. You know that, right?
No,
You're
it's
saying,
not at all.
well, no, it is. You're saying essentially
No,
that their
as an
impoverishment.
advocate for getting rid of unequal exchange, I would advocate they should be paid like equal to their productivity. I've got no problem with that. That's
You
been this entire argument that
you
I've had this whole
can't
time.
weight their contribution to our GDP based on their perceived productivity if their productivity is already being weighted by the economic conditions that mean they're in the shitter. Well, you're begging the question there. Of course, if you're only paying them or assigning wealth to them based on productivity and their productivity is being lowered dramatically because they're in countries that rely on an unequal exchange, then yeah. But that's like circular logic. Then you could be like, oh well, why are you only buying like a car from India for $1? And you're like, well, over there it's
Sure.
$1 worth of productivity to produce that car. And you're like, okay, how do you figure that? And you're like, well, they're very poor over there. It's like, well, yeah, I know, but like, what's the worth?
Well, I can actually answer this question more specifically, and perhaps this is an answer to your question. So, Jason Hickel, who I'm sure you've heard of, he's basically an advocate that we should get rid of unequal exchange. He's an anthropologist, and what he has found is that even if you were to assume that workers are the same, like let's just say that global South workers and global North workers have the same exact productivity, or like relatively similar productivity, the amount of that unequal exchange would be worth about 6.5% of GDP, right? So give you an olive branch there, it goes from 3 to 6.5%. So again, I think that even
Wait,
with the
for the
most
whole developing world?
yes,
'Cause
so even
China
with the most
alone is half a trillion to the US, which is
no,
which is
but
about
you're assuming you're assuming that every single time a good or a service is made in China, it is necessarily completely unequal exchange, and that it's all total exploitation. There's obviously workers in China that are paid reasonably well and are educated reasonably well, right? So
I
that's the
think that
problem with that type of analysis.
I think that most of China's industrial export relies on the relationship that they have had historically with the West and their consumption of underpriced goods.
Well, the stat that I quoted, I don't expect you to remember all these stats, obviously. The stat I quoted originally was that as a percentage of the whole entire world's GDP, if you assume every single time someone from the global south makes something, and that is necessarily unequal exchange, it's necessarily exploitative, what is that percentage of the exports that are sort of the world GDP? Um, it's 7.8% of global North GDP, 7.8%. But that's such a crazy assumption to make in the first place. And even if you made that assumption,
Why is it a crazy assumption?
7.8%. Well, because number one, China and the rest of the global south obviously trade a lot with each other. And so if we're concerned mostly with sort of the percentage of the global north GDP, it you wouldn't make that assumption. And also just the idea that every single time any worker in China makes a product and then it gets exported to the global north, it's necessarily unequal exchange. It's necessarily incredible, crazy labor
China
exploitation.
alone single-handedly is 20% of our imports. You're telling me that if we axed out the entire global south, it would be charitable to me to say that the global north would lose out on 7% of its GDP? I
Okay,
don't
well, yes,
and keep in
Vaush.
mind this GDP is weighted significantly because goods coming from these countries are often underpriced.
Right. So I can
No,
answer
no,
that
no. Wait,
question.
hold on.
So
We've gone over this for a while. This is insanity to me. It's
well,
there's
I just one more.
please. There are so many
Sure.
economic assumptions being made here that are wild to me. Like you've essentially circularly justified economic exploitation by saying that the relatively low amount that we pay for the goods that we get from there
Absolutely
cost
not.
are a fair cost proportion of the degree of inefficiency or underdevelopment or inefficiency that you would get from people in those countries. What we're essentially talking about is and we're talking about industrial imports too. So keep in mind, most of the United States GDP, 80% of it is like the service economy. About
Yeah.
18% of it is industrial. We don't import the service economy, we import goods. So the goods we import are a significant portion of the raw
No, I
resources that
mean
we use for
that's no,
construction
that
and
Vash,
industry in this
that's not
country.
true. I've got to stop you there. So a big part of our imports are services. You can import a service as well. And the point that I tried to get in on China is that when you talk about China being 20% of our exports, well, let's just assume that you're right. Obviously, well, if you do that percentage, right? So Chinese exports to the GDP as a percentage of our economy, you end up with under 1%, right? And so again, even if you assume,
Wait,
I'm
how?
trying to bring it back to this system. Well, because if we import about $800 billion worth of goods, 20% of that's about 200 billion divided by $22 trillion GDP. That's how you might get that number. But that's obviously a
Wait.
rough estimate on the fly. Sure.
No,
Go on.
I don't think I'm gonna be honest with you. Maybe I should have like an economist on or something. The idea to me that
Well,
you and other people
yeah,
are
you got me.
okay, maybe not one who will say that the IMF is a neutral arbiter. Like I want to have someone on because I need to know like the idea that somebody could straight facedly look at me and say like, yeah, dude, if we just cut out all trade from the entire developing world, the parts of the world that we have literally gone to war with and used like third-party organizations to control the economies of so they could be beneficial to our investment, we could cut out all of that and it'd be like a little recession. We had a massive recession from one building having a plane flown into it. I guess two buildings. Like we had more than a 3% GDP dip from the 9/11 attacks. It was a huge dip, and it took years to climb back up. And you're telling me that the entire 2/3 of the population, the global South, we could just not, and it would be like a temporary reshuffle equivalent to the harm that we experienced to our economy during COVID, that all that, the fact that you can go anywhere in America and buy goods that say made in Taiwan, made in China, whatever, that's just, it would just be a little bump. I feel like any reasonable economist would look at that and tell me, because I admit that I'm not like an economist or anything, but I feel like I've made some compelling arguments here. They would look at that and go like, are you fucking crazy? America had an economic harm done just by the tariffs to a couple of industries from China. You think we could cut out all the shit that we get from there? Are you insane? We would collapse. They would collapse. Everything would collapse. Global trade is the only way that we can sustain like fair diplomatic relationships with half these countries anyway. It's probably the only reason why China's not willing to risk war with us over Taiwan, because they know that war, even if it wasn't nuclear, would still lead to a huge recession
Yep.
for both countries. But that wouldn't mean anything, right? If it really was just some flippant little nothing, and the West could just trade within the West, and it wouldn't be like we don't actually rely on all this stuff.
So number one, we did not have a 3% recession because of 9/11 at all. Our GDP didn't shrink by 3%. The point that I was making isn't justifying underpaying these global South workers. I'm making the opposite argument. I feel like you should be more charitable with me in that regard, that we should, in fact, pay them to the same level of their productivity or to parity completely. Now, my point bringing up the 6.5% is that even if we assumed that, despite any knowledge or anything like that, if we assume that they're the same productivity, then the percentage of the economy that's based on exploitation or like unequal exchange does go up to 6.5%. And that's not a small, trivial amount of the economy if we wiped it off the map immediately, right? My only point throughout this entire debate, which I feel like is fair enough, is that in fact, it would be possible to do that, that it would be sustainable to do that. And we do see countries making steps towards that in that regard. And if we assume a little bit more charitably that there are some productivity differences, it goes down to 3%. So, no reason I don't think we wouldn't have this. And the last thing that I would say is that you say, oh, any economist would say this, this, and that. Look, forget about the education that I have, consider me an economist or not. But the people I'm citing are economists that are saying these things. The paper about 2 to 8% of GDP, if the US just totally shut off its borders, that was an economist from Berkeley and MIT.
There are other
So
economists who would disagree with that, right? For
well,
instance, I find it
obviously
incredibly telling that none of the
Sure.
numbers you're citing here describe which percentage points that would reduce in the GDP. Because again, if we lost all of our lithium, what is that? A fraction of a percent of our GDP? But
No,
it would
Vaush,
have
no one's talking
massive.
about losing. No one's talking about losing all of the. Again, the point of the paper about U.S. losing 2 to 8% of its GDP is a theoretical construct if we closed our borders completely, right? That's not what I'm advocating for. What I'm advocating for is just simply worker parity across borders, which obviously I think you'd agree with too. My only point is to say that if we did that, that would represent about a 6.5%, being incredibly charitable to productivity, 3 to 6.5% of GDP, and we wouldn't lose all of our lithium, we wouldn't lose all of our wood, our steel. We'd still get these goods. It's just that those workers would be paid a reasonable wage.
I don't believe it. Not for not
All
for a
right.
fraction of a second. I think it's actually delusional. I think this is like neoliberal shill shit that people throw out there in an effort to justify
Well,
the idea that we're
Jason
not
Hickel
exploiting the
is a
developing world.
Marxist, to be fair.
Well, I'd have to take a look at his like readings of this, because I don't know if I can trust somebody's interpretation of a Marxist paper when they're like telling me the IMF is like neutral and their shit. I like I'm sorry. This is no. Like, you can laugh, and I'm not trying to be antagonistic or anything like that. But like this,
No, I'm not laughing at your points. It's just more that obviously I'm being as good faith as possible. Of course, I don't. I think you're
I'm
being
trying
a little hyperbolic.
I'm trying to as well. I don't know why I remember that September 11th caused a dip here. It must have caused a dip in something else. But
Yeah, no
no,
worries.
it's not. Chat. It's not the same. It's not the Jackson Hickel you think it is. Shut up. Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah, no, it's
I made
just,
that mistake too.
yeah, it's a funny name. Um, no, I don't believe it. Sorry, I'm gonna need more.
No, it's
This is essentially
that's
like,
totally
yeah,
fine.
your country has spent the past two and a half centuries desperately fighting to secure economic control over the developing world, but actually it's like very trivial, and it didn't actually matter that much anyway. And the amount of our GDP that we would lose by not doing it is equivalent to like negating 1 year of growth. Maybe even not that much. Like you could basically hit freeze on the GDP growth graph for like 9 months, and that would be enough to equal us cutting off trade from the entire developing world. That, like, to me, like I feel like, can you link those papers from Jackson Hickle?
Yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, for sure. Um, well, all right. I think at the point of I just don't believe it, and I need to do more research. I feel like that's. You said you had to get out about 5:30 anyway, or 5:30 Central Time. Um, so unless you wanted to talk about anything else.
No, I have to go. There's pasta waiting for me, unfortunately.
What kind?
It has bacon in it. That's all I know. It's probably rigatoni or something.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Yeah. So I guess closing statement. Obviously, laid out there on the debate. I feel like I've justified my points. I'll link you all those papers. Thanks for letting me on. Give me the platform. Again, if anyone's interested in kind of a progressive capitalist sort of interpretation of economics, you could say that's my YouTube channel, Econoboi, and that's all I have to say.
You take care, okay?
All right. You too. Have a good day.
Bye. All right. We're on an unrelenting economic research arc until we find out why that guy was wrong. You can call me an ideologue if you want, but the idea that we've been doing all of this shit, all the imperialism for centuries, and it's like, oh, it was like nothing. I don't believe it. All of our shit is made in China and Taiwan. All the clothing, everything. It's like, oh yeah, but no big deal. Like, yeah, I don't believe it. Was that guy even a sock dem? I don't fucking know. This is, if anything, this is an indictment of like sock dems and the fact that they don't challenge the broader economic order. The fact that I had to like explain to the IMF. Ooh, okay. We need to learn more about this stuff. Washington Consensus. Secondly, the 80s and 90s market liberalization. What is this? No, I need shit on the God damn it. Soaked on leftist on research. We have to do it independently. We have to learn. Okay, 9/11 attack. Yeah. Okay, I need shit on this. I actually have been sockdem pilled lately by Rose Wrist. Is Rose Wrist a sockdem? I thought Rose Wrist was a socialist. Mr. Utilitarian, you're never going to combat climate change unless workers are control of the economy, you fucking idiot. Nope. Worker control of the economy is the only chance we have of ever applying any tax dollars whatsoever towards climate change fights, okay? You can raise as much tax revenue as you want, but as long as it's a bourgeois democracy, it's not going to help. All right. The convo literally triggered it. Well, the convo feels like I gave like 40 really good arguments for everything I believed in, and he was just like, no, actually, the data says it's 3%. And I'm like, okay, but that 3% is like weighted, and where is that 3%? And what effect does that 3% have? It's not 3% distributed evenly on everything. It's 3% like concentrated within a particular stream of imports. And then it's like, nah, but it says 3%. It's like, he changed recently, similar to the reason you don't call yourself an anarchist. He feels like a lot of the goals are too far away. Oh, God. China provides more than 85% of the world's rare metals and is home to about 2/3 of the global supply of rare metals and minerals like antimony and barite. US and Europe are worried any disruption to their supply chains would hurt key industries. Really? Oh. Well, I guess somebody should tell them that actually it's no biggie. China dominates solar PV manufacturing, home to more than 90% of the world's wafer manufacturing capabilities. The CSIS said China has most of the world's capacity for key items used in lithium-ion battery manufacturing. 80% of global battery cell manufacturing capacity? Dude, we literally can't invest in green energy without this shit. We literally need this shit for green energy. We can't not have trade with these guys. It's 3%, just stop, yeah. It's like the difference between losing 3% of your body weight or 3% of your body weight exclusively concentrated in your brain, you know? Like if somebody was like, hey dude, I'm gonna like give you a car, but you have to lose 3% of your weight. I'm like, okay, thinking that it'll come from my fucking like belly fat or something. And then I lose like my fucking spinal cord and like the Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't have my earbuds in. Just think of the bacon. Yeah, but like, why were so many economists worrying about the trade tariffs that Trump put on China hurting America when that was just tariffs on some industries from one country? Like, those tariffs were a problem, but then, like, we're not talking about tariffs, we're talking about completely cutting off all trade with all developing nations. He wasn't talking about removing the supply chains. He was simply talking about increasing how much we pay the people producing those goods. Yeah, but we can't do that yet. We can't do that right now. You know why? Because those trade relations are determined by the wages set by the Western companies that either directly work with people in those companies, or they like directly work with the companies in the foreign world that that employ those people. And why would they have them pay more? That guy unironically tried to cite fucking oil company pledges, like bank pledges to me, as an example of corporations going more green. I'm gonna Roblox myself, dude. Holy shit. I can't believe. I thought he said we should pay based on productivity. Yeah, and he was saying we should pay, like, weighted based on productivity, but, like, he couldn't tell me what the productivity, like, ratio. Like, is a productive Indian worker worth half of an American worker? Like, yes, I'm almost there, Vermin. I feel like I'm being really mean because that dude was like super nice to me, but like holy shit, I can't believe I had to spend that much time talking about the IMF. It's pretty lib-brained. Soc Dems are liberals. An Indian software programmer makes max 10K a year USD working for an American company. The pay disparity is insane. Also, does nobody else feel that the productivity bullshit is super patronizing? If you're working in a factory in India, you're about as productive as a person as anyone working in a factory in America. If the factory is underdeveloped, that's a product of the economic disparity that I would want to address here. But if you're like, oh yeah, well, you know, whatever, dude, they're like poor, so they've got like poor people factories, so they get, you know, they're worthless, you know, whatever. Like, that's the fucking problem.